Hello, everyone. I am Mrs. Dunn, and I'm here to talk to you today about the SAT and the EBRW test, which stands for Evidence-Based Reading and Writing. So we've been doing some math practice. Today, we're going to take a look at some reading practice, and we're going to focus on annotation and how important annotation is to kind of keep yourself actively reading. So let me tell you first about reading and annotation. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to learn about the reading test, what makes up the reading test on the SAT, and then we're going to talk about how to read passages for information so that you're able to retain the information you're reading to answer questions. And then I'm going to ask you to practice using annotation strategies to help answer questions. We're going to annotate a passage together, and then you're going to answer some questions about the annotated passage. All right, so first, the SAT reading test is called evidence-based because you can always find the evidence in the reading passages in order to answer the question. So you're always looking for evidence within the questions. In the SAT, there are 52 questions, and it takes you 65 minutes to complete the reading test. The reading test has 5 total passages, always 5 passages. There's one passage on science, one passage, history and social studies, one passage on literature, and then there's paired passages. So that's 3 passages and then 2 passages that work together. Some of those passages, the history and social science or the paired passages, is something called founding documents, which means that they're from the founding of our country, U.S. history. So you'll find maybe older language for that. The reading test has a bunch of different types of questions. So there are those questions that ask you to make conclusions and to infer what the writer is saying or the meaning of what the writer is saying. Those questions tend to be harder questions, more difficult questions, because they require you to understand the passage as a whole and then apply the passage to something else. The easier questions are the ones about main ideas and critical details. So it's basically simply recall, like summarize this passage or summarize this paragraph, or this sentence, like what is the best understanding of this sentence as far as how it works with the passage as a whole. Then there are some passages that allow you or ask you to compare and contrast different things. You usually see that in the paired passages because the paired passages are on the same topic, but either different viewpoints on that topic or different time periods. So there's a lot of contrasting questions. Then cause and effect, you see this a lot in the science passages. What was the effect of this experiment, or how did this experiment change the way that this was approached, cause and effect. There's questions about text structure, the beginning, middle, and end of the passages and how they move forward. And then there's questions about what is the author intending, or what is the author trying to get the audience to do, think, believe, things like that. What is the purpose and the influence? And then finally, some of my favorite questions are vocabulary and context and word choice. I say that they're my favorite questions because they're questions you can answer without reading the whole passage. All you have to do is look at one sentence in the passage. All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to go about reading. So you want to read the passage first and make sure you understand the passage before you start answering the questions. You want to try to get the passage to stick in your head. So I want you to read the passage closely, not skimming. Consider it an open book test, so when you get to the questions, remember you can go back and look at the passage, which means you want to do everything you can in the passage to help you answer those questions when you get there. When you finish one passage, don't plan to go back, like, oh, I didn't understand this question. I'm going to go back and answer it when I'm finished with the whole reading test. It's best to answer all the questions that follow a passage first before you move on to the next of the 5 passages. So you can go back and look at the questions and look at the passage, but don't plan on going back to an earlier passage. You'll probably run out of time. Okay, so how you go about reading a passage. First, make sure you understand it. And in order to do that, you want to actively engage, which means annotate the passage. So some of the things that I suggest you underline and circle include the topic sentences. What is this paragraph going to be about? Underline things like proper nouns, names, places, specifics about things, sequencing words. So if there's dates that go through the passage, you want to look at that. Sometimes when there's words like first, second, next, things like that, so you can kind of know the steps to things, dates. And then feelings or attitudes, like when the author expresses some sort of strong feeling or emotion, you want to keep track of that, because a lot of times the questions at the end will ask you like how the author was feeling or what attitude the author had about the topic. And so keeping those in mind as you're annotating is also good. Any other notes you want to make in the margin to help you remember things, you can do that. Staying actively involved in the passage, not just reading it and then answering the questions, but actually putting your pen or pencil on the paper and marking things down will help you remember the passage when you're done reading it. So we're going to take a look at a specific passage now from the SAT. And this one is about Thomas Alva Edison and his discoveries. And let's annotate it together while I kind of talk you through it. And then I'm going to have you answer the questions and see how you do with more active reading techniques. Okay, so we're going to start by taking a look at this passage. It's a history/social science passage about Thomas Alva Edison and the invention of the carbon arc lamp. So the first thing you want to do is look at the top here, the directions for the questions. Usually get some good information here that kind of sets up the reading for you. Like, for example, we get a date in here, 1879. So I'm going to circle that. And it's about Thomas Alva Edison. And you can see that it's an invention from Edison's own recollection. So that tells me that this is something written after 1879. That is Thomas Alva Edison thinking about the time in his life when he was inventing the light bulb. So the first thing we see in the first paragraph is Professor Barker and Philadelphia. And so I'm going to circle those because I don't know if that's important or not, but those are proper nouns, and that's something that I'm kind of trained to look for. So we're taking a look at what he's writing, and he's saying that there were arc lamps in those days, and then he went to visit Professor Barker at Philadelphia and saw what he did, and then we move further down, and we see that Wallace and Moses G. Farmer succeeded in getting 10 or 15 lamps to burn together in a series. All right, so he was at leisure because he had just finished working on the carbon button telephone. So what we found out about those lights were that they were too bright and too big. So I'm going to underline that. So the lights that he was working, that Wallace and Farmer were working on. What we wished were little lights and a distribution of them to people's houses in just the same way that gas is sent around and burned at your fixture when you want it. It was easy enough to see that the subdivision never could be accomplished unless each light was independent of each other. Now that's really important because that's something that they are trying to fix, right? It was plain they could not burn in series, hence they must burn in multiple arc. It was with this conviction that I started. I was fired with the idea of the incandescent lamp as opposed to the arc lamp, so I went down to work and got some very fine platinum wire drawn. So we're looking at some of the important words here, and we're getting the idea that he was very interested in this project. This idea that it was with this conviction, I was fired with the idea. That's really important. Moving forward. We tried to make platinum work. It didn't stand. We tried mixing in about 10% iridium with the platinum. So that's the next thing that we're going to take a look at. It says couldn't force it high enough, so that didn't work. Then they tried silicone and boron and a lot of other things that I've forgotten now. So that's the second step that they did. The funny part was that in those days, I never thought carbon would answer because a fine hair of carbon was so sensitive to oxidation. So that's the reason why they didn't think carbon would work. It got very good vacuum and high conditions for it. We bought some cotton thread and carbonized it and made the first filament. So here's where we get to the carbon arc lamp. the incandescent light. So we get up to the top. They built the lamp and they lighted it. It lit up. We measured its resistance quickly and found it was 275 OHMS, all we wanted. So now we know it's working. We sat down, looked at the lamp. We wanted to see how long it would burn. There was the problem solved. If the filament would last. The day was, and then he gives us the exact date. We sat and looked at the lamp, continued to burn, and the longer it burned, the more fascinated we were. None of us could go to bed. There was no sleep for over 40 hours. We just sat and watched it with anxiety growing into elation. It lasted for 45 hours, and if it will burn for 40 hours, now I know I can make it burn 100. So that's his goal, to make it burn 100. All right. So now, with all of the annotations that I've done, I can look back over the passage and I can kind of summarize it. So turns out Professor Barker in Philadelphia, that didn't really matter at all. Probably Wallace and Farmer don't matter, but there might be a question about them later. But we know that they started getting 10 or 15 lamps to burn together in a series, but we wanted lights to burn independently. So then they tried a bunch of different things. The light was too bright and too big. They wanted to burn in a multiple arc, so they tried platinum wire. Platinum wire didn't work. Then they tried 10% iridium with the platinum. That didn't work. Then they tried silicone and boron. That didn't work. And finally, they went down to carbon thread, and they found that the carbon thread actually worked, 275 OHMS. I have no idea what that stands for, but that's okay. And then they found that that burned for 40 hours. So with this, just the things that we've underlined, it reminds us of what the passage was about and helps us kind of summarize that passage in our head before we begin reading. All right, so now what I want you to do is I want you to answer questions 11 through 19 and look back at the passage at what we've underlined, remember that summary, and see how easy it is to answer the questions now that we've stayed actively engaged in the reading. And before we move on to answer the questions, we kind of look back over and summarize it based on what we've underlined. All right, good luck.